Well, welcome everybody. My name is Franny Eberhardt. I'm the president of Friends of the Upper East Side. And for those of you who don't know us, I hope you all do, but if you don't, we are a 38-year-old organization now dedicated to the architectural legacy, the livability, and the sense of place of the Upper East Side. We're delighted to be together this evening virtually. This was supposed to be an in-person celebration of our success saving City and Suburban First Avenue estates. It took 30 years, but we're glad to be together. In any case, you'll have to take care of your own celebratory beverages. I hope you have one. And you're in for a very interesting evening tonight, and then 3 subsequent sessions. For the record, this is being taped. I think that was announced, and it will be posted later on our website. We have lots of interesting things that are going up on the website. This is the good thing about having to do everything virtually. We can make it available on an ongoing basis. So you can come back to tonight. If you need to skip one of the coming up sessions, you can go to it before you head to another session and really get a lot of very interesting content, I think, on these very interesting buildings and also interesting legal case. I should give thanks to the support that we have, public funding from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. And it's specifically Council Member Kalos, Ben Kalos, who has supported all of our efforts in Yorkville very generously. He is born and bred Yorkville. He will be with us on Friday. So we look forward to his perspective on this interesting story, saga. Our moderator for all 4 sessions is going to be Lisa Ackerman. Lisa is the executive director of the Columbus Citizens Foundation, which is a organization devoted to Italian American heritage, and I'm happy to say it's on the Upper East Side in a historic building. She is an internationally renowned preservationist with a deep knowledge about preservation on a worldwide level, coming in part from her many years at the World Monuments Fund. She also teaches in the Historic Preservation program at Pratt, where she is a very popular teacher. And we look forward to her very thoughtful direction of our conversations. Our speaker tonight is Andrew Dolkart. Some of you may have been with us earlier in this pandemic when he did a lecture for us on one of his favorite topics, on which he wrote a book, for which we got lots of requests. Andrew, I hope you suddenly got a uptick in your whatever they call them, because a lot of people are saying, where do I get that book? I think of Andrew as someone who is a champion of the forgotten or the underappreciated history, specifically built history, but not entirely just built history. He is a very popular professor at the Columbia Historic Preservation Program, so we have 2 wonderful speakers with us today. I think with that, I will turn it over to you, Lisa, and everyone enjoy the evening.
Thanks so much, Franny. It's a great pleasure to be here with everybody tonight, and it is true, I now work back on the Upper East Side, where I worked a very long time ago on East 80th Street, and now I'm on East 69th Street, so getting closer to actually the location of our topic tonight. And, you know, Andrew, you've written so extensively about housing in New York City, so I know we're going to have a very robust conversation tonight. And I think just to start it off, I would say that in the era in which First Avenue Estate was built, there was a great euphoria for thinking about revolution in the way people lived in New York City. There was really a wave of social housing that we often don't think about that dovetailed with the tremendous growth in the city at that time. So the Industrial Revolution was taking hold, the city was changing practically daily. One of my favorite housing reformers was Alfred Treadway White in Brooklyn. And just to give a little bit of a sense, the population in Brooklyn in 1800 was, you know, officially less than 100,000. And by 1900, it was 1 million. And Manhattan had much the same experience. So this focus on housing was not just a bunch of well-intentioned people, it was really a desperate necessity. You've got this great influx of people and you've got to house them. And you've got a vast array of working poor who these apartments and others like them really represented a great step forward. And so, with that, I'm going to let you introduce us to First Avenue Estate and put it in the context a little bit of what was happening with the streetscape in New York and housing at the time.
So thank you, Lisa. I'm going to show everybody a few images in a minute, but I just want to continue to build on this background that Lisa has provided. And the population, of course, grew enormously, as Lisa said, and particularly with these huge waves of immigrants, very few of whom had experience living in dense cities and in multiple dwellings. So it really was a cultural shift for these groups, most of whom came from rural areas in Ireland, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, in Germany. And so a huge amount of housing was needed. And much of that was provided by the speculative builders. And it was speculative construction that created most of the tenements in which people lived. And they in themselves are, of course, one of the most fascinating stories in New York. And I've worked for the Tenement Museum since practically the day it was established, researching speculative tenements. And I've written a book about the Tenement Museum's building. But these buildings were very densely populated. They tended to be built on very narrow 25-foot wide lots. And there was, especially among the elite, a lot of criticism of this speculative housing. It didn't look good to them. It was very dense. In fact, one section of the Lower East Side was thought to be the most densely crowded place in the world. And so they were looking for other ways in which to house the working poor in what they considered, these reformers considered to be a healthier way to live. And they did this in part by building model tenements. And model tenements, like the city and suburban complexes and like Alfred Treadway White's complexes, which you mentioned, Lisa, model tenements were not model housing. They weren't perfect housing. By model tenement, what they meant was that this was going to be experimental housing that would have certain amenities that were not necessarily available in speculative tenements. Like the Alfred Treadway White buildings from the 1870s in Brooklyn, they had running water and toilets in every apartment. Whereas at that time, many people still had toilets in their backyards, or at best, maybe they were sharing a toilet in a hall with other families. And they had cross ventilation. They took fireproofing into consideration. They had light and air, which were things that people really lacked in the speculative tenements. Alfred Treadway White's tenements were a personal choice. He invested in them. Model tenements were most emphatically not philanthropic housing. This was not housing as charity. This was profit-making housing, but the people that invested in model tenements agreed to limit their profit, sometimes to 5%, sometimes to 6%, sometimes to 7.5%. Whereas speculative tenements, if they were filled all the time, reports say you could make a 20% return annually. So you're limiting what you could make. So you're providing decent housing with decent amenities, and you're limiting your profit. So Alfred Treadway White set the stage for this in America, building the first model tenements in America that were successful in Brooklyn. And then as more and more people are coming to America, as the conditions on the Lower East Side and elsewhere are getting even denser and denser, reformers start looking for ways to build more housing. And one idea is to create a stock company where people will invest money in the corporation and it will build model tenements and limit its return to 5%. And this is the genesis of City and Suburban Homes, which was founded in 1896 And its president at the time said that it was founded with the objective of supplying to wage earners of New York City improved, wholesome homes with market rate rentals. So with that, I'm going to pull up a couple of images just to show you what we're talking about.
So while Andrew pulls up the slides, I'm going to add one quick comment, which is, despite the dichotomy between philanthropic housing and for-profit housing, even if it was limited profit, this ultimately became a big business. You had philanthropic groups like the Russell Sage Foundation really very strongly advocating for the improvement of workers' housing. And then you also ultimately had groups like the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company making this big part of their portfolio, that the limited income from these housing projects lasted for decades and did in many ways become big business. So it's a fascinating tale. And now, Andrew, over to you.
And you should remember what Lisa said, because later in our chat, we're going to talk about reform apartment complexes that have not been recognized by the Landmarks Commission, and Metropolitan Life will come back into the discussion. So here, I just want to show you a few images. So the City and Suburban Homes was founded in 1896 as this limited dividend company, and the investors were among the city's most elite families. The president was Samuel Babcock, who was the president of Bell Telephone. Other officers included R. Fulton Cutting, who was a major financier, Ogden Mills, who was a banker, Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose fortune was from railroads, and members of the Astor, Auchincloss, Bayard, Gould, Lewison, Lowe, Morgan, Rockefeller, Schiff, Seligman, Sloan, and Stokes families. These are names that, if you're a New Yorker, you can't help but recognize many of those names. It's a very diverse group from different religious and ethnic backgrounds who had been very successful in New York and were investing in this. And they built a few small projects, and then they built two enormous projects on the east side that incorporate entire square blocks. And the celebration that we're having tonight relates to the First Avenue estate, which goes from First Avenue to York Avenue in the East 60s. And here you can see the first buildings in the First Avenue estate. These were designed by James Ware, a very important architect of multiple dwellings and reform housing. They were designed with storefronts on the ground floor. And what you can see here is that each one has a courtyard. And they were built out of solid material. They were as fireproof as possible. These were built in the 1890s with central courtyards, with individual stairways inside, so that there's not just one stairway for each building. There are individual stairways so that each of these buildings would be divided into about 4 different units. So you had more privacy. There's light. Every apartment looks out on the street. Many of the apartments are cross-ventilated. So there were a lot of really important reforms here. Now, there's not a lot of architectural ornament here, and that's a really important aspect of most of the model tenement complexes. They're well-built, they're handsome, well-proportioned buildings, but they weren't spending a lot of money on getting fancy carving done, as you might find on a contemporaneous apartment house for the upper middle class. So they're kept simple, and much of the ornament has to do with using different colors of brick, using maybe ornate, the fire escapes and the fire escape balconies being made a little bit ornate, and maybe a little bit of ornament at the entrance. So here you can see the First Avenue estate in its totality, and we're looking here at the York Avenue frontage. And this is the section of the complex that was most endangered. And we'll come back to what happened with these in a minute. So I guess we're going to do it right now. So just to jump ahead, the other complex that City and Suburban did, the York Avenue estate, is on York Avenue and the East River between 78th and 79th Streets. And the history of the preservation movement begins in the late 1980s here with this complex. It was owned by a developer named Peter Calico, and he decided that he was going to evict all the tenants in over 1,200 affordable housing units and build a series of high-rise luxury apartment buildings here. Well, the outcry was enormous, and there was a huge effort to get the Landmarks Commission involved. And I was involved in this fight as the historian, working with some other historians and neighborhood people, both residents and people from surrounding areas here who were really instrumental in keeping this effort going. And Calico then promised a compromise. He would only demolish some of the buildings along the river and build 2 towers on the site. The issue with landmarks was these are not beautiful works of architecture. And making the case that what was significant about these buildings was their cultural history as affordable, progressive housing in New York. It's not that the architecture is to be dismissed, but that the architecture and the design were at play with the cultural history, with the creation of affordable housing here. So finally, Landmarks agreed to hold a public hearing, and they chose to hold the public hearing on both of the Upper East Side complexes. And the owners put up an enormous fight against the designation. They wrote so many reports that they actually made our case more strongly than they knew about the significance of these buildings. I would say that their reports stack up to about 3 or 3.5 feet in linear feet on a shelf. So these were designated as landmarks. They went before the Board of Estimate. The Board of Estimate in the old days had to approve all landmarking, and the Board of Estimate deleted the easternmost buildings in both complexes. So that is the river frontage here, and the York Avenue frontage on the First Avenue estate. And at 79th Street, the community group sued and took the city to court, and the courts ruled that they had to be designated again, that the Board of Estimate had overstated its powers with that. But this complex was not part of the lawsuit. So these buildings facing on York Avenue remained undesignated. And then in about 10 or 15 years later, an effort was made to get these buildings landmarked again. That Jessica Lappin, who was then the city council member, led this effort, and the Landmarks Commission scheduled a public hearing. And just before that public hearing, the owners stripped the buildings. And you can see the comparison on the left is what it originally looked like. On the right is what it looks like today. They basically ripped off the parapets, removed all the detail, and covered them in pink stucco. And so what the advocates had to do was make the case that the architecture was not why these buildings were being designated. It was for their cultural significance. And the fact that it was a stucco facade didn't affect that cultural significance. And that case was made very strongly, and Landmarks designated them. And then there's been a series of lawsuits, which finally the preservation advocates, led by Friends, won. And so the whole complex is now a landmark again. So you have these buildings, most of which are courtyard apartments. The apartments are relatively small, but they have kitchens and they have bathrooms in every apartment. There's cross ventilation and a lot of amenities. You can see here some details, some original details. On the left is a kitchen cabinet. In the center, you can see the dryer up on the ceiling. And on the right is a living room that gives you some idea of the interiors. of these complexes. So I'm going to go out of this.
So Andrew, while we're switching gears, I think one of the things that sometimes is lost in the discussions about landmarking and you know why this was such a breakthrough case, but also the buildings themselves, and not just First Avenue Estate, but this whole ensemble of buildings from that era. They ultimately led to very significant changes in building codes and laws and things that we now take for granted. For instance, in New York City, you can't legally have a bedroom that doesn't have a window. And many of the experiments in these housing complexes ultimately led to very significant changes for all housing in New York City.
In fact, the Avenue A estate, I mean, the First Avenue estate, those images that I showed you on First Avenue, they were begun in 1898. And in 1901, there was a huge effort to reform the housing laws and basically make it almost impossible for speculative builders to build on 25-foot wide lots. This was considered the root of the problem of substandard overcrowded housing. And so the courtyard building that City and Suburban built on First Avenue were quite influential in the creation of the 1901 law. And the 1901 law mandated minimum room sizes, maximum lot coverage, bathrooms in every apartment. So these were all ideas that City and Suburban had promulgated and expressed in all of its buildings. Now, I should say that one thing that's really interesting about City and Suburban is it's built in Manhattan, where land values are enormously high. In Brooklyn, in Cobble Hill, where Alfred Treadway White built the home and tower model tenements, land values were relatively low. And so he could leave a lot of open space in his buildings. But that was not possible in Manhattan, where land values were expensive. Even though they didn't have to demolish anything to build either one of these complexes, they bought undeveloped land. So they are quite dense in their usage of the lot, so that they could get 1,059 apartments on the York Avenue estate and about in the First Avenue estate, and about 1,200 apartments in the York Avenue estate at 79th Street. So a lot of the advances that City and Suburban talks about become part of the 1901 Tenement House Act.
So that's great. And I think, you know, we're only going to get a snapshot tonight, but I think there are two obvious questions that still remain for tonight's discussion. One is, despite the changes to the buildings over time, and all buildings, in order to survive decades, and in this case, a century, they have to adapt. I mean, the standards for electrical wiring change over time. In this case, significant changes to the exterior. But, you know, what to you stands out, even today with those changes, as things you really want people to know about these buildings? And then my follow-up question is, you know, it's fantastic that we're celebrating this milestone anniversary for a long, hard-fought struggle to secure landmarking status for the buildings. But undoubtedly, there are other buildings around the 5 boroughs that we would love to see recognized as well. So I hope, in addition to talking about what still stands out to you as quintessentially important for these buildings, what are the other buildings we should be strolling by now that we can walk freely around the city with our masks on? You know, what are some of the buildings we should be looking at?
Well, I think that, to me, what is really significant about City and Suburban is that here we have the city's wealthiest people investing in affordable housing for the working class. And so they are creating affordable housing in New York. And, you know, think about that there was a time when people were willing to invest in building affordable housing in the city, and how difficult that is today, and that these remain affordable housing. Now, they were at the time market rate for working class housing, and when the fight over saving city and suburban began, we, as part of our project, we interviewed a lot of people who lived in the complex on 78th and 79th Street, and it included people that were in their 80s and 90s who had been born in those apartments, and it was, or people who had moved to those apartments from speculative tenements. And it was really interesting to hear them talk about what it meant to move into these and live in these complexes. And what I think is really crucial today is that these remain affordable housing. Yes, the apartments are small, and you know, a lot of New Yorkers think that, oh, you have to have a large apartment, but New Yorkers live in small apartments very often. And so you can have 1 and 2 bedroom apartments here that are relatively small, but are very well maintained. Of course, there have been changes. There have been updated kitchens and updated electricity and other infrastructure, but the basic form of these buildings remains the same, and the basic idea of who's living in these buildings remains the same. Now, probably fewer working class and more middle class people are living in these buildings now because they are Manhattan rents, but they provide an alternative to the luxury housing that's going up all around on the Upper East Side neighborhood. And to me, that's really powerful within the architecture. And for me, because I'm interested in the physicality of the city, the fact that these complexes are so redolent of New York as working class city, and that these buildings have been able to adapt to the changing nature of the city is really, really powerful. And so it's really thrilling to me that these are preserved. And I give a lot of credit to the Landmarks Commission. These were very, very courageous designations. It would have been easy for the Landmarks Commission to say, no, they don't have a lot of architectural interest, we're not going to do them. And I think that this was the beginning of the Landmarks Commission's realization that the law does say that buildings could be designated for their architectural, cultural, and historical significance. And in the realm of culture and history, these are really, really crucial. And the commission has designated a number of important housing projects. The home and tower buildings are in the Cobble Hill Historic District. They designated the Sunnyside Historic District in Queens, which includes the Phipps model tenements. And so there are other important progressive housing complexes that are landmarked, but there's a lot that has not been designated. And I want to look a little bit about what we should think about doing in the future to recognize the whole history of housing and housing reform, at the same time that we should also be recognizing the significance of speculative tenements. And the Landmarks Commission has designated an East Village Historic District that's largely tenements. And hopefully there'll be a district on the Lower East Side at some point in the not too distant future. But I want to look at some of the progressive housing. So City and Suburban was really influenced other other model tenement construction. Sometimes there were other companies. There was the fireproof tenement company that the architect Ernest Flagg worked on, but a number of model tenements were built by private individuals or charitable organizations. It would be great if the Landmarks did a survey of all of them that survive and see which ones are worthwhile. This is the Emerson on 10th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, which was named after its architect. And this was privately funded and was abandoned for many years. And this was a Historic Preservation Tax Act project to restore this. And you can see it looks quite beautiful. And one of the last of these complexes was Flagg Court in Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. This was designed by the great architect Ernest Flagg, best known as the architect of the Singer Building and of St. Luke's Hospital and of the Scribner Store on Fifth Avenue. And this is an enormous project with a huge amount of open space in a courtyard, and originally had a swimming pool, which is what this sort of orientalized pavilion marks the location of. And this, this is an obvious landmark to me. Because a lot of reform housing was built in the 1930s, and indeed, in the 1930s, a study was done of city and suburban. It was called, I think, something like 30 years of limited dividend housing. And so city and suburban had an enormous impact on ideas for working class housing during the Depression. And Hillside Homes is a great example. This was partially supported by the federal government and was a complex for working families in the northeastern Bronx. And I love these Samuel Gaccio photographs where all the people are carefully set up here. These are completely artificial photographs. In fact, a student who's on this event tonight did a seminar report for me this past semester on Hillside Homes, and we talked a lot about these staged photographs. Here's what it looks like today. It was in ruinous condition 20 years ago, and has now been fixed up and rehabilitated, and it's now working class housing again. And you can see the beautiful brickwork in these arches. Similarly, Parkchester, which was the first major project of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which Lisa made reference to. This is an enormous complex of over 70 buildings in the Bronx, also in the Southeast Bronx, and establishes the idea of the tower in the park with a lot of wonderful witty ornament, as you can see in the polychrome terracotta soldier on the right. That was part of the ornament on the complex's movie theater. This is also from the 1930s, Boulevard Gardens in Woodside, Queens, which was another project that got some federal mortgage guarantees to build working class housing. And I went to visit it just before the lockdown, and it's in beautiful condition, and is still serving the purpose for which it was built. A lot of reform housing was done as not-for-profit co-ops by groups that organized, usually working class groups that organized to build cooperatives. And the first of these cooperative apartment buildings in the United States were built by Finnish immigrants in Sunset Park. And these are Alku 1 and 2. Alku is Finnish for beginning. And these are listed on the National Register. And they are not works of great architecture, but they're incredibly important in the history of housing and should absolutely be priorities for landmark designation. Similarly, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union built its limited dividend housing projects. This is Amalgamated Housing in the Bronx. Amazingly, this is not a designated landmark with its enormous landscape courtyards. And even more amazing is that Amalgamated Dwellings on the Lower East Side with this spectacular Viennese-inspired courtyard with its parabolic arches is also not a designated landmark. Nobody has really looked at housing after World War II. The earliest public housing projects, First houses, Williamsburg houses, and Harlem River houses are landmarks, but Amsterdam houses and Abraham Lincoln houses from the immediate post-war period are not. Landmark West has been advocating for Amsterdam houses for quite some time, to no avail so far. And all the huge urban renewal projects in the 1950s, many of these projects are things that some of us got involved in preservation because we hated, but now a younger generation has come around and shown us just how important these projects are. So Riverton was a Metropolitan Life Insurance Company project. It was the Harlem response to Stuyvesant Town. Stuyvesant Town was segregated. There was a lot of movement to integrate Stuyvesant Town, and rather than do that, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company built Riverton in Harlem. And then next door to Riverton is a wonderful project from the 1980s River Bend, or in the 1970s, River Bend housing in Harlem. And then a project I've been working on, I just finished writing a report to get Lenox Terrace declared eligible for listing on the National Register. And this was the first middle-class urban renewal housing project built to keep the Black middle class in Harlem. And it was 6 Tower in the Park projects that are, like City and Suburban, not of great architectural interest, but of enormous cultural significance. So these are complexes that I think we should be looking at and thinking about this kind of housing and the history of progressive and reform housing in New York that responds to the needs of the working and middle class.
So Andrew, I'm going to stop us there because we promised people a chance for questions. And I'm going to encourage everybody who has a question to write it into chat. We've got 2 people monitoring the chat so that questions can be answered. And Lara Session will read the questions. And I think, we could talk for hours about housing in New York City. And I became endlessly fascinated with housing, both through preservation, but also when I was a student at Pratt, and really began to look at the city with different eyes and understood the consciousness with which many of these complexes went up. And as you say, a lot of us became preservationists because we hated Tower in the Park architecture. And we found it dehumanizing. And I'm sure we have lots of terrible things that we could describe it as. But in a lot of ways, it still is emblematic of something you said during your talk, which is there was a time where we considered it to be an important thing to invest in affordable housing. And indeed, we live in a city now where this is a constant struggle. And there's always that fear of the city becoming a city of, the very poor and the very wealthy, and what happens to everybody in the middle. So I think, you've given us a lot to think about, both the cultural significance of First Avenue Estate unto itself, but also the door and window it opens to really the way the city developed and how we thought about the way people should live in this city. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to see if we've got questions. Andrew, before we do that, yep.
I want to add one thing, because you make a really important point, and I think that it's really important to emphasize the fact that we've been talking about City and Suburban, which was private individuals investing, but I also showed you images of buildings that were sponsored by the city, the state, and the federal government. And isn't it hard to believe that there was a time when the government thought that it was part of its responsibility to provide affordable housing to its citizens? And that has kind of disappeared, and we need to get that back.
Great point for the transition to questions. Laura, are you ready to kick us off with some questions?
Yes, I am. But before we start, I think one thing that we'd like to ask everyone to do is just turn their videos on and go into gallery view, so we can see everyone and end this as a more group conversation. So everyone, if you'd like to turn your videos on, please do so, and we'll see everyone and start with a few questions. There is one interesting question about someone is studying a family that moved into the First Avenue Estates in 1938. And so far she is under the impression that those apartments are highly desirable. And she's trying to figure it out how did people get these apartments? How could you be able to rent a unit in such a desirable apartment? Were there any qualifications or something?
Well, first of all, you had to apply. So there was a waiting list. You went to the City and Suburban office and you filled out an application. And there were requirements. They checked your income. They preferred 2-parent households. You had to be they preferred having the husband working and the wife at home. There was a lot of very traditional ideas here, and so there was, I wouldn't say it was onerous, but there was a little bit of social control involved. They often would send rent collectors around who would kind of check up on the fact that you were maintaining the apartment in a decent way. So you did have to fill out an application to get in. You didn't go to a real estate broker, like you might today.
Thank you, Andrew. There is another question about a similar building to the First Avenue Estates on 73rd Street between First and York. And the person that is asking this question is wondering if it's related, it's from City and Suburban, or if it's a prototype, or if it's just architecture, just a similar style.
I'm not positive. There is an individual City and Suburban complex on the north side of one street in the East 70s, or I think, or the high East 60s or the low East 70s. And that might be it. It's sort of a yellowish brick building. And if we're thinking of the same buildings, it is a City and Suburban project.
If we're wrapping up, we said we would, run about 45 minutes. So if there aren't any other questions, I think, first of all, we want to thank everybody for participating tonight, and also say that tomorrow we'll be speaking with Will Cook about the legal aspects of First Avenue Estate and the long struggle to landmarking. And we'll also be talking on Thursday with Tony Wood about the community engagement, because one of the hallmarks of this case was this really wasn't preservationists going to the barricades to save a building. This was a very broad constellation of local groups that cared about a wide range of things, not just traditional preservation activities, but cared about the streetscape of the Yorkville neighborhood, cared about quality of life issues, cared about affordable housing. And so Tony is going to talk about really the very broad coalition that formed during the course of the march towards landmarking. And then Friday, we're going to have a real jamboree with all of the speakers back and some special guests, and a chance to really talk synthetically about what this case meant, what these buildings mean to us today. And I think, as Andrew has aptly pointed out, the lessons we should be learning about how this informs the city we want to have today and tomorrow in terms of housing and how we live within the city. So if there aren't any other questions, Laura, I'm going to wish everybody a great evening, and hopefully everybody's going off to a great dinner now with great thoughts in their head. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.